We'll start with the Broncos first and foremost, and the NFL's worst-kept secret for an extended period of time. From the day Russell Wilson was benched for Jarrett Stidham, a quote-unquote spark, this was inevitable. The Broncos today finally admitted and publicly stated what everybody knew was going to happen. The Broncos would release Russell Wilson. The statement from George Paton and the Broncos says, quote, "We spoke with Russell Wilson today to inform him of his release after the start of the league year. On behalf of the Broncos, we thank Russell for his contributions and dedications to our team and community while wishing him the best as he continues his career. Forward, we're focused on building the strongest team possible for the 2024 season and beyond. We're excited to improve this offseason, and we'll have the flexibility to get better through the draft and free agency." Sort of legitimacy of some of that in a bit, Sandy. But the first reaction, of course,
the folly of such statements, which is nothing
don't
new.
Have a second-round pick, and free agency is going to be severely hampered by the biggest dead cap money in the history of the NFL.
Which
no matter
they
how the
seem
Broncos
determined to spread out over 2 years. And
right.
The only question is, do they take the bigger hit in year one or year two?
Right.
That's all that needs to be decided, because apparently that's the route they're going, rather than take the hit all at once in 2024 and be, relatively speaking, clear after that. But as Jeff Legwell pointed out this afternoon on ESPN.com, the longtime Bronco reporter, it's just a continuation of the malaise, and I think that is a kind term that is set in over this franchise. In the last 8 years, it's played out on the field for all the world to see. And if you want to break it down, take out the first 10 games before the bye in 2016 and take a look at all the games that have taken place since then. Also take a look at the 131 games started by quarterbacks not named Peyton Manning since Manning's retirement following the 2015 season. There have been 13 starting at the position, with, of course, one of those being Philip Lindsay, who's actually a running back.
Right.
In a game against the Saints in which, in something very easy to believe when you're talking about the Broncos, 3 quarterbacks, not one, not two, but 3 quarterbacks were stupid enough to clearly violate COVID policy, to the point where I think if the league had to do it over again, they'd have suspended them all for the rest of the season. I think that would have been the right
they just
move.
ran the Broncos to be humiliated, which is
right.
exactly what happened.
Against, ironically, Sean Payton's New Orleans Saints. That was back in 2020, and that was the game that Lindsey started as the Broncos opened in Wildcat, and then they went to Hinton, who I think threw for 13 yards in that game, as the Broncos were embarrassed, humiliated on regional television by the New Orleans Saints.
They weren't on national back then.
They weren't on national TV.
No, not a lot of need for that.
The national folks had learned by then what to expect from this clown show, and the clown show continues. And Legwald noted that really it doesn't improve their chances of being even competitive in 2024 by merely finding another scapegoat. The Broncos have been very good at one thing over the last 8 years, finding scapegoats. They have majored in scapegoating. They have been the biggest scapegoating organization in major professional sports for 8 years now. If not the worst, then the one that is most anxious to scapegoat, act in simplistic fashion, speak in terms that are designed to fool the public, when the only people the Broncos are kidding are the Broncos themselves. And those ridiculous statements continue. They came out of the combine last week from Sean Payton, to an extent from George Paton, the nominal general manager of the Denver Broncos, who made this disastrous trade. And if you go down through the years and look at bad trades in the history of the NFL, where one side clearly fleeced the other, You won't find a better example than this one. The Minnesota Vikings didn't get a great player in Herschel Walker when they traded with the Dallas Cowboys more than 30 years ago. But at least they got a functional one. And I don't believe Herschel Walker, as a pro anyway, was ever really a great player. He had some statistics, and he was a good player in Minnesota. I don't know that he was that much different in Dallas than he had been in Minnesota. But that was the all-timer up until this deal was made.
Right.
And again, the people in the know with whom I spoke the night of the trade said, and this should have been a tip-off for all of us, and it should have been a tip-off for me most of all, the people who were most upset by the trade were the other teams in the NFC West, who thought that Seattle got immeasurably stronger in making this trade, that they got rid of a quarterback who was clearly over the hill, although his decline was much more precipitous than anybody could have anticipated. But the notion that Seattle fleeced the Broncos was felt by, obviously, three teams in the NFC West, the rivals for the Seahawks, and the Seahawks themselves knew they had fleeced the Broncos.
The Seahawks in the season before, in the 2021 season, which they had Russell Wilson, went 7-10 and were last in the NFC West.
Right.
In the last two seasons in which the Broncos have had Russell Wilson, they have gone 9-8 in both years.
And made the playoffs once.
And made the playoffs one time and finished second behind the Niners in 2022 and then finished third because the resurgent Rams, of course, stepped up and made the playoffs themselves. But the truth is that Seattle did get better, if only incrementally so, despite the fact they were working with a relative cast-off in Geno Smith and to a lesser extent Drew
But he
Lock
played better than Russell Wilson, at least in 2022.
And the trade in and of itself obviously is disastrous, and the fallout will continue because even though the Broncos will say that they're excited about their opportunities to improve in the draft and free agency, remember, they've already given up a draft pick. The second-round draft pick that they want to have this year doesn't come from Russell Wilson. That comes from Sean Payton.
The Broncos have consistently, much more so than the fan base, and I mean much more so than the fan base, more so than the media, although the media tends to follow what the Broncos say rather than what the fans are telling them.
Right. The double-edged sort of access has to do with that.
Constantly are delusional about their talent. Everybody in the AFC West with whom I spoke, directly and indirectly, at the time of that deal said, do the Broncos watch football other than their own games, maybe? Do they not know? Were they so irresponsible to make a trade for a guy who was clearly in decline? And the Seattle people knew about it. They knew that emotionally, psychologically, Russell Wilson was scarred by the death of his mentor, psychologist, business partner, and that his play on the field had deteriorated. Last year, the coach did the quarterback no favors, but nobody ever says the quarterback didn't do the coach any favors either. It's all blamed on Hackett. And this year, although he had a much better year than he did in 2022, almost anything would have been better.
Right.
The irony is that this year, having a much better year, Wilson got much more blame than he got a year ago when he was almost historically bad.
And that's due to Sean Payton's reputation more than anything else, because Sean Payton's a Super Bowl winner. Of course, Russell Wilson's been a Super Bowl winner.
Right.
Russell Wilson's been to two of them.
A lot more recently than Sean Payton has won or been to a Super Bowl.
But the nature of every sports league, and the NFL is not immune, NFL fans are not immune, is that the new shiny thing, especially if you've heard of it before, is going to be the fix. It was Russell Wilson. Okay, well, it's not Russell Wilson. Okay, it's not Nathaniel Hackett. But Sean Payton's in town. He'll fix everything. Well, it couldn't be Sean Payton's fault because he's here to fix everything. It must be Russell Wilson.
I mean, I do believe, and I could be wrong. I don't do surveys of everyone who considers himself or herself a part of Broncos.
It is funny because apparently when you and I talk about this, we have sort of vastly different.
We talk to different people.
Vibes
and my people, the people with whom I speak.
Sandy has people.
My peeps.
He's got peeps. Of course he does.
They're sick of Sean Payton already. They've signed off on him. He's an arrogant bore. He is the most insecure head coach I've ever been around in 45 years here in Denver. And I say that not knowing him, but merely by his public presentation, is the most insecure, paranoid coach who, even when he's trying to be positive, comes off merely as arrogant. The statement made at the Combine last week, we're good at this. We? He could have said, I'm good at this. But even for Sean Payton, that would have been ridiculous because he's never had to find or develop a young quarterback in his career. He always had Drew Brees, save for 1 year, and he benched Russell Wilson this year after 15 games. He's never done it. So he says we, which is even a bigger joke for an organization that not one time in its history that goes back to its first AFL season in 1960, not one time has drafted and developed a capable quarterback. Certainly for the long term.
No.
It has literally never happened. So
I mean, I
we're
have that for
good
you.
at this, whether he's using the collective term applying to himself, which I expect he was, or he does mean the collective we. A coach who has never drafted and developed as a head coach a quarterback.
Only started a rookie quarterback once, one game in 275
and an
career
organization
playoff and regular season
over the course of 64 years.
That
has never, ever drafted and developed a successful
I've researched that, and I've kept it for you. So here you go. To further Sandy's point, all the way back to 1960, this is every quarterback that has won 5 or more games as a starter that the Denver Broncos have drafted in their history. Brock Osweiler went 5-6. Tim Tebow went 8-6. Tebow, by the way, 1-1 in the playoffs, is the only Broncos drafted quarterback to ever play in a postseason game. Ever.
And win.
He's also the one to even
lose.
He's the only one, he's the only one to ever appear. Drew Lock went 8-13. Trevor Siemian, 13-11. Notable that is a winning record, by the way. Yeah. Jay Cutler went 17-20. Probably the most talented quarterback, at least the Broncos have drafted. And Brian Griese went 27-24 in his career. Only Griese and Siemian have winning career records. Only Tebow has ever started a playoff game in the history of the Denver Broncos, dating back to 1960. This organization, I understand there are different owners, different people in charge, but the organization itself has never drafted a long-term success at quarterback, ever. And Sean Payton's never done it either.
It is hard to find certainly much in the way of postseason success, even at times postseason participation, outside of the 15 years of John Elway, 16 actually, and the 4 years of Peyton Manning. That's 20 years in their history where they've had someone special at quarterback. 20 years.
And I mean, it's at the same time, because you had John Elway and Peyton Manning, I get why people look at it and go, well, nobody feels bad for the Broncos. You have 2 of the finest quarterbacks that have ever played the game, and each of them won a Super Bowl.
No, he's asking just the opposite. You feel, in some ways, almost contempt for an organization. I thought the best judge of talent purely as a matter of judging talent, I would nominate John Ralston as good a judge of talent, as successful in drafting. Now, John Ralston was not an effective head coach, at least not here in Denver. He was not. At Stanford, it was a little different, but here he was not successful. For all the great drafting John Ralston did, even John Ralston could not find that quarterback.
None of the guys that we listed were John Ralston drafted. And the idea, I'll give you this.
Even he couldn't find one.
The QBR ranking in the modern run, of course, it's 1 to 100 scale. 50 is average. These are the Broncos quarterbacks, the primary Broncos quarterback of the year, and I'll work it up. Trevor Siemian in 2017, his last year as a starter, had an abysmal QBR of 30.9. Russell Wilson in 2022, 38.7, also abysmal. Drew Lock in 2020, 41.2. 2015, note I'm pointing out 2015, Peyton Manning, 44.2. Case Keenum in 2018, 44.5. Teddy Bridgewater, 47.4. Now you're getting at least towards average play. Trevor Siemian in 2016, 49.7, about as average as you can get. And that, of course, was the last ever Broncos team with a winning record.
He got as close, other than Wilson, who did it this year, in 14 starts with over 3,400 yards passing and a 49.7 quarterback rating. He got as close to hitting 3,000 yards and 50.0 as a quarterback rating in the same season as anybody other than Wilson, who actually did it this year, right, and the reward was getting benched.
Joe Flacco in 2019 had a slightly better one, 50.8, slightly better than Wilson's 50.7.
But he didn't even throw for 2,000.
Right, he did it in 8 games, not 15. So by virtually any measurement, disappointing as it was for Broncos fans, Wilson's season last year for the Broncos is probably the best they've had since the 2014 campaign.
Yes, I would agree with that. And you know
the
what?
best.
The second best is Teddy Bridgewater.
And I agree. I would put Bridgewater ahead of that year with Siemian and Flacco. I would personally rank Bridgewater ahead of that, too, in the 14 starts he had.
Bridgewater statistically had a year very similar in 21 to Wilson's 2023 season. Passer rating 98.0 for Wilson, 94.9 for Bridgewater. And quarterback rating 50.7 for Wilson, 47.4 for Bridgewater. They're the two seasons that came closest to fulfilling a promise. And actually, Teddy Bridgewater was not benched because of poor play, as Wilson allegedly was. Teddy Bridgewater's unable to play during that 2021 season for the final 3 games after starting the first 14 because he got hurt in that 14th game against Cincinnati, at which point the Broncos were 7-6, and they did not win another game.
Right.
They lost to Cincinnati, went on to lose the rest of their games, all 3 of them with Drew Lock as the starting quarterback.